Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this Friday morning event on Russia. We have lots of discussions on Russia, but I hope this one will be slightly different from the ones you are used so far to. It's my pleasure to introduce everyone on stage. So the setup will be one in which the speaker, whom I will introduce, will have the go, will have the first go, and then we will have a talk show. Basically, in which we try to engage the speaker, and then you will be afterwards invited to engage us, not us, but also him. So let me start with the panels here. So it's Maria Merkse from the Center for Military Studies here at Copenhagen University, who is originally Estonian, so close to what is going on, and a specialist on many things, honestly, having worked on critical security studies, international political sociology, has been working on rituals, has been working on deterrence, has been working on memory politics, and this is very close, so should work out. It's a great pleasure to have her here. She's here since a little bit more than a year, having worked beforehand in Brussels at the. Then we have Karen Philippa Larsen, who is working with us here at DIIS. She is a specialist on private military companies and has been working very much on the Wagner Group, on the Russian Wagner Group, and therefore will be a good interlocutor for the talk today as well. Then it's myself. I'm a senior researcher here as well at DIIS in the Diplomacy and Foreign Policy Unit, working on world order, different types of foreign policies and so on. And now comes the star, which is Alexander Astrov, who is the professor at the Central European University, by now in Vienna, no longer in Budapest, who is, how does one introduce it? You are not a Russian, but you are Russian, right? Because he's not a Russian citizen.
My mother tongue is Russian. That's the connection. And otherwise, you can say I'm Soviet. I never lived in Russia. I used to live in the Soviet Union, but never in Russia.
Not that Soviet makes it much nicer, but the so he is a specialist on great power politics, on world order and diplomacy, and has been working a lot also on Russia at the Central European University, and it is a great pleasure to have him here. I think he's one of the remarkable theoreticians in international relations at the same time, and that is therefore a great pleasure to welcome you, Alex, to Copenhagen for not the first time, but it was a long time before, after the first time that you came here. So the setup is given. We will have a talk which will give us some ideas about how to understand change in Russia, or non-change in Russia, and Alex will tell us a little bit about how to think about how to understand change in Russia. And I invite you to the floor. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you everyone for coming and for having me. But I have to start with a disclaimer that I don't think I have the right to speak from any position of expertise for several reasons here. First of all, Stefan mentioned that I was here before, and that was a workshop, on a book that Stefan edited then on the return of geopolitical thinking in Europe. And that at that time, many years ago, looked pretty much like an intellectual exercise, but now it's pretty much in your face. Also, just before this war, I was asked by many people, what is going on, what is going to happen? And I have to admit, I didn't think that was possible. So at some point, I was ready to believe that Putin and Russia would march on Donbass, but then them marching all the way on Kyiv, that I didn't see it coming. And for this reason alone, it raised the question for me, like, how do I know things? And more generally, how do we know these things at all, especially in the case of regimes like Russia, which is not transparent. You don't have the facts, you don't have standard institutional arrangements, because everything is happening in one man's mind, and none of us has access to his mind. So how do we actually know what he's thinking and why he's doing what he's doing? So that is why the focus is on this kind of questions, like how do we know, right? And one of the things we can't go by with in these matters is what Putin is saying, right? His rhetoric. But that again raises a lot of questions. If you go for his latest major speech at the International Discussion Club in Valdai, in many ways he was repeating old things that we heard from him many times. But then there were also some things that were new. For example, this whole stress on post-colonial themes, that Russia is ready to lead the world in its fight against neo-imperialism of the United States and, as they like to speak now, to say now, Anglo-Saxon world, right? And in this kind of rhetoric, for example, Putin was, to my knowledge, for the first time, using the term mankind, человечество, right? And when we hear in this part of the world, when we hear words like mankind or humankind, we think of, like, I don't know, human rights, human security, and things like that. But this is clearly not what Putin meant. And you can see it clearly if you recall that already after the war started, Putin signed the so-called concept of Russia's humanitarian foreign policy. And this is sort of a standard notion. Again, humanitarian foreign policy, its origins are actually with Russia, when at the Second Hague Conference, it was a Russian diplomat and international lawyer of Estonian origin, by the way, Fedor Martens, who introduced this so-called Martens Clause, which said very clearly that, look, there are actors other than states in world politics, and they have rights, and their rights should be respected, the rights of individuals, the rights of peoples, and so on and so forth. But if you read Russia's today humanitarian foreign policy, there's none of it there. It's all about state power. It's all about enhancing state power, but using what we sometimes call like soft power, using non-state means, but the end is the same. It's kind of state power. So the first puzzle here is, what is this difference about? Why it is that the same concepts, like humanitarianism, for example, understood so differently in the West and in Russia? And straight away I rule out the possibility of simple ignorance, that Russians do not understand. It doesn't matter whether Putin personally understands or not, but there are people in the Russian state who surely know what this is all about, and still they use it differently. So why do they use it differently? There are some explanations for that. For example, some researchers in Norway, not far away from here, they did some interesting research on why concepts, as they travel from one culture to another, for example, from the West to Turkey, they change their meaning. And they have some theories about that, because concepts, they are not just words. They do not have fixed meanings. They are fluid, they are ambivalent, and when this is coupled with translations, then some changes do happen. But still, we don't see from this explanation is how exactly this happens. What is the mechanism there, right? And especially, we do not see what is going on when this process of conceptual and cultural translation, when it is out of the hands of few intellectuals, and when it is happening on a mass scale, well, what seems to be the case in Russia. So we need some kind of understanding here of how do we approach this kind of rhetoric. But before I try to offer this understanding, I have to say a few words about one possible objection. Because one possible objection would be, and it is there for quite some time, well, why bother with rhetoric, right? These are just words. Politicians will always say whatever they have to say. Don't pay attention to that. Look at what they do. It's just what, for example, some Ukrainian politicians are saying now when they say, look, don't pay attention to what Russians are saying, just look at what they do. And if you look at what they do, you will see that it's the same old Russia since at least Ivan the Terrible. Nothing is changing. They are doing the same thing. And that's the only thing that matters. But the interesting thing about that is that those very people who for decades used to say that, oh, rhetoric is not important, rhetoric is epiphenomenal, these very people are now actively building their academic careers around the study of rhetoric, political rhetoric. And there is obviously a reason for that, and it has to do with populism, it has something to do with social media, with fake news, alternative facts, and so on and so forth. But what is interesting is that I think the reason why there is this research of this kind and why it is becoming very popular is that these people, they did not change their basic assumptions about the language. And the world for them looks something like this. There is a world out there which is independent of what we think about it. It's independent of how we speak about it. It's just there, right? And language is used simply to describe this world out there. And ideally, language should be transparent. You just see things and you call it what it is. But with populists and with all the Trumps and all the Orbans in the world, they are not using normal language. They're using coded language. They speak in code. In other words, they mean one thing, but they say another thing. And in rhetoric, this is called figurative speaking, right? And that's what all of us are doing when we use, for example, metaphors. So, for example, we say, not a girl, but we say a rose, because the girl is like a rose, you know, that's a typical example. And that's why these people are interested in rhetoric. But one example of how they understand it, I think it's very revealing. There was recently, just now, a book published by Oxford University Press on this kind of use of rhetoric, and it uses an example which is close to me, because it's about Central European University and how and why Orban kicked out Central European University from Budapest so that we ended up in Vienna, right? And the article interprets all this as part of his campaign against the European Union, which started in 2016 and was called in Hungary Stop Brussels. And the central figure in that campaign was George Soros. So the explanation they have in that particular book is that this is when Orban used this kind of cultural codes and metaphors in order to achieve his goal. How? Because cultural code is something when you say one thing, but your audience understands what you really mean. They understand it kind of immediately and subconsciously. And because there are metaphors at work which are fixed, like, for example, you say finance, you say Soros, and everyone thinks, okay, wealthy financier. And the moment they think wealthy financier, they immediately then think a Jew. And the moment they think a Jew, anti-Semitic sentiments are triggered, and they are already against Soros. Once they're against Soros, then they are immediately against everything that is associated with Soros, like Central European University. So Central European University kicked out. I don't believe in that, right? Because metaphors do not work like this. How they work. When we say, to take a very simple metaphor, when we say girl is a rose, right? We may mean all sorts of things. We may mean a girl is beautiful as a rose, but we may also mean, well, the girl looks beautiful as a rose, but if you approach it improperly, it will be prickly. Or we may mean a girl seems beautiful and fresh as a rose, but as with the rose, this beauty and freshness will soon fade away, right? So we need some additional knowledge in order to understand what is going on. And this is why, because when we use metaphors, we stress relations between two things, right, that we are comparing. And these relations, they can change. They may be different. And so we invite our audience to participate in the game which involves a puzzle, right? And as Aristotle already knew, this puzzle should not be too difficult, right? But there has to be something puzzling about it. It's like we teach kids, you know. We play a game with them, we give them tasks which require some effort, but they are not insoluble. And so when they solve them, they feel that they are not just the audience of this message, they are the authors of this message. And so they relate themselves differently. That's one of the reasons why rhetoric works, right? And then why it also works is that because language is never just describing the world, and it is never transparent. Language itself is a code, and it always requires some background knowledge in order to understand it. And to give a very simple example, I can take just 3 letters of Latin alphabet, right? M, G, A. And I can construct a number of different messages with just these 3 letters. I can say MAGA. For some people it would mean nothing. For other people who know American politics, that would mean make America great again. But here's the trick. Maybe for just one person in this audience, for Maria, it may mean something else, because it's an Estonian word. It's a simple Estonian word which means sleep, you know? So in this case, you have to know not only Estonian language, for example, or American politics, but you have to know the context in which I'm using this particular combination of 3 letters, right? So, and this is what cultural code is. Cultural code is not a coded message. It's a knowledge which allows us to decode any message, right? So, let me give you an example which is more related to Russia and more complex than this. You probably all heard or read about a tragic accident in Russia at one of the military training grounds in Belgrade, which happened right after Putin announced partial mobilization. Because what happened there is that several new recruits, apparently Tajiks, so Tajiks ethnically, but Russian citizens, right? They took up arms and opened fire on their peers and killed around 12 people. So what is the background story there? And it's very interesting, because what happened there is that when these new recruits arrived on the training ground, several of them, Azeris, again, Azeris ethnically, but Russian citizens, but that also means they are Muslims. They sent a report to their commanding officers saying that they do not want to fight because this is not their war. And in response to that, the commanding officer called a general meeting, and in that general meeting, he tried to explain to them why it is their war. And when he tried to explain that, he used the term because it's a holy war. And then these Tajik soldiers, they said, no, 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 no. According to the Prophet, the holy war is jihad. It's against the infidels. This is not what's happening here. Then commanding officer said, well, if this is what your Prophet is saying, and if your Prophet is not ready to fight for his country, then he must be a coward. Oops. So they took up arms, and the next sort of followed. It seemed pretty obvious. So these two groups, the commanding officer and Muslim soldiers, they operate within different cultural codes, right? But it's more complicated than that. Because the next question we have to ask there is why this commanding officer used the term holy war in the first place. Because it comes from a song that was created during the Second World War, during the what in Russia is called Great Patriotic Song, War. And it has a verse that goes like this: rise up a great country, rise up for a mortal combat, a people's war is going on, a holy war. And that song was in circulation in the Soviet Union ever since. So in the Soviet Union, everyone knew this song. And in the Soviet Union, everyone would have understood what this officer is talking about. But since then, all the institutions that made this understanding possible, primarily mandatory secondary education, mandatory military service, and so on, they dissolved, and new institutions came to the fore, including religious institutions. Hence, the difference in the understanding. But that's not the end of the story, because we can ask another question. We can ask, why is it in the Soviet Union, in a militantly atheist state, there was a song with the words holy war in the first place? Why did that happen? And we have an explanation for that, because it can be found in the memoirs of Soviet writer Ilya Ehrenburg, who was a central figure in the Soviet propaganda effort during the Second World War. And he describes an interesting situation, because in the beginning of the Second World War, of the Great Patriotic War, Red Army soldiers often refused to shoot Germans. Why? Because they were operating within a different cultural code, a cultural code that was created by Lenin and Trotsky during the First World War, and which said that, look, all wars are wars waged by imperialists, and they're driven by this great power chauvinism, and the victims of these wars are toilers and peasants on all sides. And so the Soviet soldiers were saying, why should we shoot our German brothers, whereas the actual perpetrators of these wars are in Berlin? And so the Soviet propaganda faced a very serious task of redefining not just the war, but the meaning of the Soviet state. And this particular song was part of that effort, but not the only one. As many of you probably know, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin disappeared for several days, and when he came back and gave his first speech, instead of starting his speech with the usual address, like comrades, he started it by saying brothers and sisters. And there was a big process there, which was the process of redefining the identity of the Soviet state, which culminated only decades later under Brezhnev with this notion of the new historical entity of the Soviet people, with Russians, of course, occupying a dominating position there, right? So what we see here is that cultural code is deliberately redefined, right? But this deliberately is not the only way possible. I can give you another example when the cultural code changes, but you cannot identify a specific author, and you cannot say, oh, this is why they did it, this is who did it. In the Soviet Union, there were many problems, but one of the problems which everyone knew was the problem of public transport. I will not talk much about it, but what actually happened, especially during morning hours, you walk into a bus, you just cannot move here. You're just like packed like sardines, you know, in a can. But you have to buy tickets. But you cannot move, and conductors cannot move either. And there are these small ticket dispensing machines throughout the bus, but you cannot get to them. And so there was a practice that people were passing down small change and expecting tickets to be passed back. And it worked every time, you know? And you would say, oh yeah, this totalitarian society for you. You know, people pressed into masses, moved from one place to another, and so on and so forth. But it is possible that this practice actually precedes not only the Soviet Union, but even public transport. Because what is known is that the same practice of passing down small change existed, of all places, in Russian Orthodox churches before the revolution. Why? Because in Russian Orthodox churches, unlike in the Western ones, during the liturgy, you are not allowed to sit, so everyone was standing, and churches were packed. And still you had to make a donation, and that's what people were doing. They were passing down small change towards those boxes, you know. So the practice is the same, you pass down small change, but the meaning changes completely because conditions are different. So when you pass change for donation, it's actually a good thing that you donate anonymously. But when you pass change for a ticket is actually a receipt, right? A proof that you personally paid for this particular right. So it's, sociologically speaking, it's a very different kind of thing. And this change, you cannot say, okay, so who's the author here? What is kind of going on here? So these are two extremes, right? On the one hand, you have voluntaristic action. You have people who say, look, we need to do that. We have to change cultural code. And they work hard to do that. On the other hand, it happens on the structural level, sort of of itself, without clearly identifiable author. But how exactly does it happen? What is the mechanism here, right? We can write very nice histories about all this, but theories, where's the theory? What is happening here? And so I think if we want to understand the theory here, it may be helpful to turn to poets, right? Not because poets are, you know, visited by muses and they have an inspiration or anything like that, but because it's actually their job. They work with language, and by working with language, they make explicit what all of us are doing implicitly every day with language, right? They just make it visible. Same as social scientists, when they come up with their theories, they make explicit what is implied in everyday practices. And I will turn to one particular poet, Bob Dylan. I think it's justified. He just got the Nobel Prize, you know. And also he published a book just recently which is called Philosophy of Songcraft, right? And I turned just one of his songs. It's a simple blues. It's not one of those big ones. It's a simple blues which is called Meet Me in the Morning. And it comes from a special album, which is still one of the most popular albums of Dylan, by which he himself was puzzled always. And in one of the interviews he said, I just don't understand why so many people would want to relieve all this pain. Because the album is called Blood on the Tracks, and it was written and recorded when his marriage was falling apart, so it's not a happy album, right? But what is really interesting about it, it's full of this thing which we will call mixed emotions, right? Because it's not just this sadness, it's not just sometimes hate, but there's a lot of love there. So there is this kind of love-hate relationship there. And the last verse of this particular song, it goes like this. Look at the sun sinking like a ship. Ain't that just like my heart, babe, when you kiss my lips? So there are two metaphors here. The sun is compared to the ship, and the ship is compared to the sun, to the heart, right? So if you start with the last one, it is clear why he is using that, because we usually say, we always say, sinking heart, right? My heart sank. We say so because we usually also say, my heart sank like a stone. And we say, my heart sank like a stone because we have this other expression, which we all know, heavy heart. I'm with a heavy heart. But the experience that Dylan is describing here is different. It's not about heavy heart, right? So he starts with the established, fixed association between two things, heart and stone. And he changes it by relating the heart not to the stone, but to the ship. And then he can compare the ship to the beautiful sun sinking into the ocean, and he comes up with a different arrangement. So he uses what rhetoricians would call mixed metaphor. And for the rhetoricians, mixed metaphor is a mistake. But it works for Dylan, right? And in rhetoric, there is a word for that. There is a term for that. That's a special trope, which is called katachresis. And literally translated from ancient Greek, katachresis means incorrect use of a practice. So a practice is used in a way in which it was not meant to be used. And this, I think, is what's happening. And incorrect use of a practice usually works like this. We somehow make the original use obsolete. We forget its meaning, or make the audience forget its meaning, and we introduce a new meaning instead, right? To give a simple example, in Russian we say red ink, just as you would say in Danish, right? But the problem is that the Russian word for ink is chernila, which actually means black. So whenever in Russian we say red ink, we are actually saying red black, which is stupid. But everyone understands that what we mean and that it works. Now, let me show how this works in Russia and in Hungary, and with that I kind of finish. So I mentioned this conception of Russian humanitarian foreign policy, right? It's not the only such conception. They have conception of food security as well. And again, it's not just them. Everyone has conception of food security in the world. And Stefano just reminded me in the morning today that Indonesia used it heavily at the latest G20 meeting, right? But when in the West we talk about food security, we usually talk about human security, we talk about access to food, and so on and so forth. Now, if you read the Russian conception of food security, there's nothing about that there. Food security in Russia means food independence. And this food independence is heavily securitized because they say, look, we don't want our soldiers to be dependent on the food provided by Americans. Because by the end of the day, one day or another, we will have to fight Americans. And this conception of food security was a poster child of Russian opposition ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This opposition was led by a bloc between communists and agrarians. And for decades, it was absolutely ignored by all Russian administrations, including Putin's first presidency. They just made a lot of noise. They were redefining food security, making it mean something else, food independence, but it was never a law. And then suddenly, and during the presidency of Medvedev, who was the most liberal, the most pro-Western of all Russian presidents ever, this is signed into law. And that raises a question, why? What is the link between Medvedev and Russian communists? Why they finally found this kind of common language? Well, the usual explanation would be, oh, because they have a common enemy. But Medvedev's enemy at that time was not the United States, or as they say in Russia, collective West. So who was that common enemy? And here we turn to Orban, finally, and I give you my explanation of what is happening there, what happened there, and why Central European University was kicked out. And I think it's more interesting than the one I cited in the beginning. So the campaign started indeed in 2016. It was called Stop Brussels. And the opening event of that campaign was an annual speech that Orban delivered on the occasion of the anniversary of the revolution of 1848. And what he was saying there, he was saying, look, in Brussels, they are cooking a revolution. They want to transform Europe into a federal state. But we Hungarians, we can tell Brussels something about revolutions because we know better. Why we know better? Because we had a few, but even more importantly, because we Hungarians, we had both good revolutions and bad revolutions. So we had good revolutions of 1848 and 1956, and then we had a bad revolution of 1918. So we know the difference, right? How do we know? We know because it is in Hungarian culture. So what is Hungarian culture? Hungarian culture was created by Hungarian poets. Hisas, Sándor Petőfi, and others. And then, so all this is more or less unquestionable. But then comes a trick. He says, and Hungarian poets were always with craftsmen, button makers, farmers, and not with those impotent intellectuals who are sitting in all sorts of universities and stuff like that. So what Orban is doing, he's saying, this is who we are Hungarians. That gives us certain kind of knowledge about certain political processes, which is better than the European ones. We are Hungarians because this is what Hungarian culture. But the right and the expertise for the interpretation of Hungarian culture and Hungarian identity does not belong to universities or to intellectuals or to science generally. It's kind of more grassroots, right? So when he does that, it's not unique to his populism. What he's doing exactly what Martin Luther was doing when he was saying, why is it that only the priests can interpret the Bible? Or what the scientists were later doing when they were saying, why is it that only the Bible can tell the truth about the universe? So, you hear this contestation around the cultural code. What is this underlying knowledge which is not spelled out directly, but which allows to understand everything else? And what is the class, the group of people who have the monopoly on the interpretation of this knowledge? That is what is at stake here, right? And it is also at stake in the case of, say, food security, but not only, because this is where I use the work of Russian semioticians when they say, look, because texts are only intelligible once you know the cultural code, but cultural code is never explicitly stated. There is always a class of people who spin the original message. Shamans, oracles, priests, scientists, media people, now TikTok influencers, right? So this is changing, but there is always a class of people who do this job. And this is where the contestation is happening. And the Russian, another Nobel Prize winner, the Russian editor of the Novaya Gazeta, Dmitry Muratov, he got it very nicely when he said, look, the way it works, they sit in the Kremlin, they come up with a message, they cannot know whether it will work or not. They just throw it into the public sphere, and they start spinning it. And after a while, some parts of this message stick, they begin to work, and they come back to them from television. And by that time, they no longer remember that it was them who invented this message. They say, look, it must be true because they say so on television, right? So the message is completely reified. This is how it works. And now, another thing, the last thing which is important here, is that when Orban is giving his speech in 2016, another thing that he's saying, look, I'm talking politics here, but I'm not talking politics in the idiom of science. So you can fact check me until you are blue in the face. But I'm giving you poetry, and poetry cannot be fact checked. It just appeals differently. So I'm immune from this kind of criticism. And that raises questions because, oh, can you actually move that freely between poetry and politics? Especially so, given that on many other occasions, Orban insists very strongly on policing the boundaries of politics. One of the reasons why he is against Central European universities or NGOs, he says, look, I'm fine with NGOs until they dabble into politics, because politics is mine. He just went a few days ago to the World Cup wearing a scarf which has a map of Hungary, including Ukraine, Romania, and all the rest. And people started expressing concerns. And he said, no, come on, this is football. This is not politics. Don't mix the two, right? So with one hand, he's saying, oh, I can talk about politics whichever way I want. I can talk about politics like poets. But then on the other hand, he's saying, oh, no, politics and poetry are separate things, right? So how does he reconcile that? And he reconciled that by saying, look, we are a modern society. In all modern societies, there are these separations, or what we call in science, functional differentiation. There is church, there is state, there is culture, there is economics. They are separate. They exist by their own rules. But the boundaries between them, they are controlled by the state, by the sovereign. And that is why you are not allowed to cross these boundaries. And I, as a sovereign, I can tell you where they run. And the problem of Orban is that since modernity now entered this kind of new reflexive stage, this differentiation within society can no longer be contained within these boundaries policed by the state. It's much more radical. It spills over. And he, Orban, wants to re-establish this control, just as Putin wants to do the same. And you can see that in his rhetoric. This is where I'm ending. So, Putin, this is the very last part. Putin, his main form of communication with his audience is television. He doesn't even have a mobile phone. He not to mention Twitter or whatever, right? But from time to time, on special occasions, he writes articles. And there are 3 of them. One of them he wrote in 1999, when it was already clear that he's becoming the president. The other one he wrote in 2012, when he was about to return to the Kremlin from being prime minister. And the third one just before the war in Ukraine. So these are important points, right? It's clear that he chooses to write an article for a reason, because something important is happening here. Now, if you look at all of them, in all 3 articles, he's saying the same thing. He's saying Russia is a great state, it's a great power, and the task of our politics is to make it great again. In this sense, nothing changes. But there is something that does change, and that is his standing vis-a-vis functional differentiation. And especially in the 2012 article, you can see that he actually uses the term cultural code. He says, well, we can only become a great power if we unite against what is central for our Russian culture, our cultural code. And then he invites a general discussion on the cultural code, which is of course orchestrated and limited and so on. But what is really interesting is that in that discussion, very quickly, cultural code becomes genetic code. And this, of course, doesn't mean that Putin is an ethnic nationalism. Putin hates ethnic nationalism. It is clear, it can be proven. But what it means, he means that our cultural code is something natural. It is not up for discussion, you know, it is fixed, it is set. It's like genetics, it's like a natural phenomena. You know, there's nothing to discuss there. We just need to follow it. And you see this in his very latest public appearance when he met the mothers of soldiers who died in Ukraine already. And there he said something outrageous. If you really want to hate Putin, you can forget everything except for this one thing. When he said, yes, I'm really sorry your son has died in Ukraine, but you know, it's better than dying from vodka. He died for a good purpose, you know. He fulfilled the meaning of his life, which is, by the way, standard sort of conservative rhetoric of a certain kind. But it also implies that there is one purpose for everyone, you know, to die for your state. And it's interesting that one of the mothers then recorded a video address to Putin when she said, look, this is not why we gave birth to our sons. This is not why we raised them, so that they die for someone else's purpose. You know, but that is the real conflict now in Russia. And that, I think, is the real change, that Putin wants to stop this ongoing differentiation, which is going out of control, and not only in Russia, right? But he's particularly radical in that, and this war is one of his responses to that.
Thank you very much. You can actually take the
good.
seat and round here. All right. So there was a slight division of labor, which you will notice now, namely that he was not talking too much about Russia, because that was our task now to squeeze more out on the direct and empirical part on Russia itself. This being said, there are a couple of things that I just wanted to repeat. So it's the idea about understanding the other via cultural codes, that these cultural codes change. They can be changed voluntarily in a kind of propaganda machine, but they can also change incrementally without anyone really looking for it. And that to some extent the understanding of what is going on in Russia is to try to understand whether these cultural codes are changing. And you end by saying, well, one of the main dangers, risks, or whatever there is that the cultural code being connected to identity, to the redefinition of national identity. Here it is also connected to the redefinition of what the state means, and that the state is somewhat dreaming about returning to good old days which never were, in which the state was able to control all the parts of the society, be it civil society, the economy, the culture, the religion, the academic environment, and so on, because it sets the boundaries, it sets the tone for every of the other. So it's in a certain sense an unifying control, which is almost the worst totalitarian nightmare that one can imagine. So the ending was not particularly, how can I say, upbeat, if you want to put it this way. But then the question is, how do we understand this kind of change going on, not just in the intention of Putin, but in the reality of the Russian society and in the context of the ongoing war. So I think that's the setup on which we try to have the discussion right now. And I don't know if any one of you has a first start. Yes, then I move over to Maria.
Thank you. And thank you, Alex, for this thought-provoking talk. I mean, I found very interesting this sort of contestation, of course, that is happening also around this cultural code. And I think something that strikes me and that I'd like to probe more about is the very cultural code of war. Because even those of us who grew up at the very tail end of the Soviet Union remember this mantra: whatever comes, the main thing is that there would be no more war. That was the sort of the long legacy of what was known in the Soviet Union as the Great Patriotic War, the Great Trauma, and sort of working obviously also sometimes, under the banner of peace, while vigorously fighting somewhere else, but still, the idea was that there can't be war, that we would directly be fighting on our territory. And now this is something that probably has been changing for quite some time. So this code is changing. And in relation to that, there is this more empirically embedded cultural code of various tropes related to the Second World War, of course, which Putin has used when building up the case for invading, full scale Ukraine in February. The tropes of denazification, but then also, of course, decommunization, which had more to do with what Lenin gave to the ungrateful Ukrainians who now are tearing down the monuments. This was, of course, ironic on my part. But this has also changed because now suddenly it's not anymore that much about Ukraine per se, as it is some sort of vendetta against the West. Anti-Satanism and whatnot. So what is happening with that code, and how significant actually is this World War II cultural code in Putin's repertoire, but perhaps also, more broadly in the Russian society?
Okay, so briefly to refer to Stephanie's question, like how do we know these things, especially when we cannot identify specific actors, I can only say what I'm always telling my PhD students, and initially they all hate me for that, but not always. I just repeat what Ted Hope actually wrote in his book on Russian foreign policy, that if you want to do this kind of analysis, it is really frustrating, but you just keep looking, and you look at everything. You're interested in Russian or Soviet foreign policy, but you look at theater plays, at films, at novels that are published in the time, and you keep looking until you begin to see some pattern. And then you start trying to conceptualize this pattern and to understand it. And I think, yes, in this kind of analysis, there are others, of course, but in this kind of analysis, this is the only way. And if this way we look at questions that Maria asks, I think, yes, this whole process started long before the war. Yes, indeed, the mantra of the late Soviet Union was anything but war, no more war, right? But we know that already, for example, at the World Cup, Soccer World Cup that was held in Poland and Ukraine, there were Russian fans unfurling big banner saying, "This is Russia." And it was not clear what did they mean. Did they mean the Russian team? Did they mean themselves? Or they meant Warsaw, actually. And this ambiguity, I think, was deliberate. Because at the European Soccer Cup in Moscow, at the end, when they actually lost it, but sort of in a good way, but they lost it, and the team went back to the field unfurling another big banner, which said, "Играем за вас," right? So you can translate it as, "We are playing for you," right? But actually, grammatically, it is incorrect, because another way you can translate it from Russian would be playing instead of you. So you are sitting there watching, and we are playing instead of you. But it becomes completely unambiguous the moment you change one word. Not playing for you, but fighting for you. And if you listen to how the whole thing was covered on television and everywhere, they saw it as a fight. This football cup, just as Olympics before that, were seen as kind of simulations of war, right? And I'm not even mentioning these banners with the Russian people riding streets in BMWs with banners saying, "We can repeat," by which they mean that we can repeat going back to Berlin, right? And just yesterday, actually, the former boss of Russian Space Agency, who is now responsible for Donbass, was saying on state television, he was saying, look, with Donbass it's clear, Donbass we are liberating, but we will not stop there. We will conquer Kiev, Berlin, Vienna, and Budapest. No. We will conquer Kiev just like we conquered Berlin, Vienna, and Budapest before. Right? So a new axis of evil. So what is really interesting is just to trace this process, right? But that would be a history or genealogy, right? But I think as a kind of general mechanism, I think what I was trying to say sort of describes it. So you kind of forget the previous meaning, the previous understanding of, in this case, war, and you gradually, not just in one bold move, but gradually on many different levels, you introduce the new one. Some of them work, some of them don't, and that relates to denazification, right? So there are two levels here. There were reports in Russian media that one of the reasons why denazification no longer works is that they do it by trial and error, right? They introduce denazification, but then they are polling the society all the time. And through this polling, they found out that this is the least popular part of the justification of war. And some people cannot even pronounce denazification. So you cannot spin it on television, you know, so they had to drop it. That was one reason. Another layer to that is, of course, they are losing war, and in the Russian psyche, it's impossible to lose war to Ukraine, you know? Like losing war to NATO is not good, but it's sort of understandable. But losing war to, like, what, Ukrainians? That's just unthinkable. But let us recall that in 1905, Russia lost war to Japan. And that was the first moment in history when a major European power lost a war to a non-European power. But they, of course, they don't remember that, because on television, they say all the time, look, we won all the wars we fought, as if Crimean War never happened, you know? So again, it's selective. It's like what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. But then the third, last layer of denazification, which I found interesting, because in Russia there is one word which describes both Nazis, like real Nazis, and any kind of nationalism. So in English there is a difference, Nazis and nationalists, but in Russian it's just Naziki, and you can use it both ways, right? So that is why it is possible in the Russian political discourse to say Nazis and actually to mean just nationalists. Not least because general public in Russia knows very little about Nazism. Holocaust is never studied in Russian schools the way it was studied elsewhere. And now they're even toning it down more. If you remember, when they set up the first museum, anti-Holocaust museum, in one of the former concentration camps, Soviet Union was invited to have its own barrack there, and they refused. So that is why Nazism in the Soviet Union and in Russia, again, means something very different from what it means, you know, in the West. And that's why it's possible to use it, but whether it works or not, it depends. If it doesn't work, they come up with something else.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. This is really very interesting. I really particularly enjoyed your example of the public transportation, about how this practice stay the same, but the meaning is different, right? And now the cultural code is perhaps the code to understand this meaning, like the underlying change of the meaning. Also in this war, the current war, that's a war to a very large extent, as you said, against the West. And I want to ask a little bit about the meaning for the relations to Russia of this change in the cultural code. How do we then perceive Russia, or foreign relations perhaps coming from Russia? Because previously, or at least the literature talks about this ambivalent relationship that Russia has with the West. So at the same time, being an example to follow and an example to reject. Russia has a tendency to mirror itself up against the West, or had perhaps, that's about my question actually, but always arguing that Russia is better in a sense, right? Even more European than Europe in a sense, right? We hear this. But it was an understanding that the West to a large extent set the scene or the rules for the competition, and Russia then like in their own image at least, outplayed the West from this perspective. And I want to ask about this change in the cultural code that we see in this war. Does that also mean an end of this ambivalence? And in that case that it does, is there a new set of rules that Russia is then playing by in the relations with the West?
Yeah, thank you. This is what I wanted to talk about anyway. So I start with a very practical kind of answer to this question. I think you are right that since Peter the Great, at least, all the deals between the West and Russia were one way or another based on the same trade-off. Not liberalism, but certain form of governmentality versus modernization. So, for example, detente, this is how detente worked. So, okay, be a little bit more tolerant towards Jewish immigration, towards dissident, whatever, and we will help you with pipelines or other technologies. But it was the same after the Crimean War, when Gorchakov said, okay, we withdraw from Europe, we have no ambitions here, we focus on Central Asia now, but we need modernization. We need railroads, we need all the other stuff and so on. It was the same story after the war with Japan in 1905, after the Second World War, and so on. And that kind of deal was only possible because actually Russia wanted modernization. And it is not for nothing that during Medvedev's presidency, modernization was the buzzword. That was kind of the punchline of his presidency, modernization. I think that Putin actually says we no longer need modernization, certainly not that kind of modernization. We have China, we have Iran for some purposes. That's the first thing, and that makes any possible future deal with the West different from what was before. Second, Putin is also, and this is a more complicated story, Putin is saying at Valdai that, oh, we are all open for technological exchanges, for scientific cooperation, and so on and so forth. By which he means, okay, we are for technological modernization. We understand that we are behind here. We are ready to catch up. But no longer this kind of cultural modernization or social modernization. This we do not like. But the problem is that historical sociologists and philosophers like Manuel de Landa, in his study of war technologies, he showed very clearly that these two cannot be separated. That at some point the West not just adopted Chinese or Ottoman military technologies, which were superior at that time, but actually improved on them, just as you rightly said, Russia hopes to do, because of its social organization, which included this diversification, right? And actually, Putin, I do not expect Putin to read Manuel de Landa, but Putin could have read Nikolai Leskov. And Nikolai Leskov, who was always a marginal in Russia, imperial Russia, in the Soviet Union, then in post-Soviet Russia, he has this one particular tale which is rather popular in Russia. And it's just about that. It's about Russian Emperor Nicholas going to England and seeing a gadget there. And the gadget is a small metal insect, a robot basically, that can dance, right? And he's so impressed that he buys it, like you would buy an iPhone today. Takes it home, dies. When he dies, they find it in his belongings. No one knows what it is about. But then someone shows it to the next emperor, Alexander, and he is convinced that Russia has to catch up with the West, but it actually is better. And so he sends an envoy, interestingly, to where is Ukraine today. And he says, find me some craftsman who can improve on this gadget. And he finds a craftsman. This craftsman does something with the gadget. They show it to the emperor, and he said, I don't understand, it's the same insect. And they said, no, 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 look. And it turns out that this craftsman put horseshoe on each insect's leg. You know, that's kind of improvement. So they take him, they send him to England to study there. He studies there. English are impressed. They offer him, as we would say today, residence permit, a wife. He refuses because he's a true Russian, he's a patriot. He said, no, I'm coming back home. He goes back home by sea, and on the ship, together with one of the officers on the ship, they drank themselves senseless. And once they arrive in St. Petersburg, the officer is taken to a good hospital where he is recovered, and this craftsman is taken to a normal hospital where poor people are sent to die, where he dies. But before he dies, he is desperately asking everyone to send a message to the emperor that the English are using different ways of cleaning their guns, and that it's time for the Russians to learn that because the war is coming. And it was written during the Crimean War, right? But no one listens, and he dies, and the message is not relayed. Now, the interesting thing here is that the name of this craftsman is Lefty, and he is lefty because he is left-handed. But if you read the full title, he's not only left-handed, but he's also side-eyed, and he's a drunkard. So in other words, in today's language, he's a queer, you know? And when today over 1 million of young people, IT specialists and so on, leave Russia, and Putin's spokesperson is asked, oh, what do you say about that? He says, well, it's a process of cleansing, right? They are not proper Russians. They leave. Let them leave. You know, so I think that is the real tragedy, that rather than learning from real past experiences of Russia, which taught it again and again that, look, you have to respect difference because that's what drives progress and innovation. They are learning from some abstract, marginal ideas of some weird, usually Western, by the way, conservatives. And the word человечество, mankind, that Putin uses in Valdai, it actually comes from a book by a very good Russian scholar, linguist, Nikolai Trubetskoy, who after the revolution immigrated from Russia and wrote a book titled Europe and Mankind. And it's the same rhetoric, that there is this kind of mankind, right? And then there is European chauvinism, which believes that Europe is the thing, you know, in the world. And this is the beginning of Eurasian tradition in Russia, but also the beginning of Russian geopolitical thinking. So Putin takes this geopolitical part from there, but he actually doesn't look at the rest of it when Trubetskoy is saying, look, Russia became only better with the integration of different cultures, religions, and, you know, so on, by becoming diverse. So
I will not ask a question because otherwise we won't have time for opening up. If there is no question from the audience, I'm happy to step in, but I would like to open up. So if you could help, so we have 1, 2, 3. Yeah, over there.
Yeah, thank you, Alexei. I'm also Soviet, so we kind of have some shared experiences in respect. I'm Vera Skirskaya, social anthropologist, Copenhagen University. I was really looking forward to your talk because the question of Russian political culture is one that really interests me. But of course, this event is about Putin's wartime discourse and Russian political culture. So my impression is that you really covered Putin wartime discourse and applied your methodology to talk about certain kind of concepts and the ways they were used and maybe manipulated. But I didn't get much in terms of how this analysis, this, not even analysis, this methodology and focus on Putin discourse can really tell us something about Russian political culture in a sense. That I think is a more important thing to understand during this war. And I'm sure you're familiar with Alexei Yurchak's book on, you know, everything was forever until it was no more, when he also shows how this kind of top-down control of cultural codes releases this kind of mass of kind of free thinking, free acting, so to speak, individualism, or whatever one call it, right? And now we can see that it's kind of closed upon itself. So I was thinking, to kind of make it short, when you look at cultural codes, you look at cultural codes that, from my point of view, kind of lie on a surface, like the idea of great patriotic war, and the idea of war, is it good, is it bad, is it something we expect never to happen, right? But there are cultural codes, if you wish to use this terminology, about the kind of more deep-going ideas of justice or even sovereignty. And just to illustrate it for everybody, I have also friends in Russia, and when this war happened, of course, my reaction was as reaction of most people originally from Ukraine, to call my Russian friends and say, oh my goodness, what are you gonna do? And they were kind of this liberal, active, you know, traveled widely in the West, well-to-do Russians, and they kind of wrote to me back, well, what do we supposed to do? You come here and do it with us, or come here and help us, you know? And I was reflecting upon it as an anthropologist, and I thought, this way of even framing this proposition by a well-educated, well-traveled, kind of westernized, English-speaking people only shows to me that they have no concept of what sovereignty is about. They invited me, a foreign national, to go to Russia and fight for their rights in Russia, right? That is kind of a slightly off of the scale. I mean, this is just a very primitive illustration of what I mean, that there are these cultural codes related to more fundamental concept of political culture that has nothing to do with Putin. And my impression is that this excessive focus on what Putin says or doesn't say, what he thinks, is just kind of brings us away from the real issues.
Okay. So, yeah, you're making notes, as I see, so I will wait for it. Yeah. Okay, okay. First of all, thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I'm Oksana Didik. Well, I represent Kharkiv National Pedagogical University. I'm PhD fellow there, political sciences, and here Copenhagen University, research assistant. I'm doing my research on political branding. So my question, well, it's so much similar to what Vera has asked, but there is so much focus on Putin, and in our speeches, in the mass media titles, we all see such phrases like Putin's invasion, Putin, whatever, attacking Ukrainian cities, and so on. How do you think, does it leave a certain space for the collective Putin? I mean, the people who stand behind Putin, the whole system, the rotten system of Russian modern government, to stay at power when the Putin era ends, like when there is no Putin in Russia. So this is the main question. And of course, like, how do you think, also personally, is Putin that kind of political evil genius, or just a kind of brand ambassador of this rotten regime? Yeah, this was my question. Thank you.
Well, thank you for some very important notes, particularly on this cultural coding issue. I'm a historian working with, among other things, Soviet film. And what strikes me is, if you look at the role of film under Stalin and how that was used for cultural recoding. And I particularly worked with the film Alexander Nevsky of Eisenstein, which is a radical change in cultural coding, firing all the administration of the film world in 9th of January 1939, and then giving permission to make the film Alexander Nevsky, in which Stalin himself personally involved himself, sacrificing the Russian soil, reintroducing the Russian Orthodox Church as some sort of background for the fight against Rome, which is here the German knights, backed up by the cardinal, who is or papal legate, who is accompanying them, and then having the genius stroke of having Prokofiev making the score of the music. And in many ways, I'm stunned by seeing how much, when Putin recalls the Second World War, he actually recalls the Stalin policy of recoding. So I would like you to, if you have some comments to this process. It is much more and more, I think, we have a re-Stalinization of Russia just going on now.
All right, deep cultural code, brand ambassador, re-Stalinization, nothing more.
I'll start with the re-Stalinization thing. I would not call it this way, but I agree with the similarity that you notice. But I think the explanation for this similarity, I would call it somewhat differently. I would call it re-ideologization, right? So for decades, ever since coming to power, Putin tried, I think really hard, to stay outside of any ideological framework, because ideology itself was seen as kind of a bad thing. There is a famous moment when the first census was conducted in Russia under Putin. The state agents, they were visiting homes with questionnaires, the usual stuff. And of course they visited Putin, and of course it was televised. And of course he was asked the same questions as everyone else was asked. And one of the questions was, what is your occupation, right? And Putin said, well, I'm a manager here. And I think he meant it. He meant it during his first presidency that, look, I'm not interested in any ideologies or whatever. I'm just like managing the country, rebuilding it, whatever. But now he is. And one of the reasons why he is because it's impossible to perform the task that they are performing now without having some kind of glue holding the society together, which will bring me to your question eventually. And so there are all sorts of reports that they are inviting people to the Kremlin with a specific task of coming up with a new Russian ideology, which would be working for this time. But this new Russian ideology, so far at least, comes down to three things. And interestingly, there was just a decision published by the Ministry of Culture that they will support only films pursuing these three themes. And because there is no other support, right? Hollywood is no longer working with Russian filmmakers. So these will be the only films produced in Russia for the next few years, right? If nothing changes. And the themes are decadence of the West, Anglo-Saxon neo-imperialism, and Russia's peacemaking. So you will have a lot of Alexander Nevsky's, produced soon. And by the way, Stalin was not the only one fascinated with Alexander Nevsky. This whole Russian Eurasian tradition is all about kind of forgetting Peter the Great and bringing Alexander Nevsky to the fore, precisely because it opened up like many possibilities that were not there if Peter the Great is at the center of the whole thing. Now, this leads me to the question of these alternatives. Now, of course, there are alternatives. I just chose to focus on this, right? But I could have told stories which I find interesting about publications in state-controlled media in Russia, where I believe people are using this double-speak. They seem to be kind of supporting the regimes, but actually they are saying things which are not that pro-regime. The same way it was done during the Soviet Union in samizdat. So there are different forms of opposition and resistance. And I also believe that this effort of Putin to kind of put a lead on this diversification and these various forms of self-expression, it will not work eventually, because it cannot possibly work. It will do more harm than good. But what I was trying to talk about, his discourse, what I think he is trying to do, right? Whether he will succeed or not, that's kind of a different question, but it's a question which I would not, I am not courageous enough to try to answer right now, right? Because what we are seeing now is also an exceptional situation. It's a wartime discourse. And it's not even clear whether it will continue after the war, and if that war ends, and depending on how it ends, And that, of course, leads to even more risky question of possible other Russian government. I don't know. I have no clue, and I think no one knows at the moment. The only thing I know, which interests me, which, again, it interests me because it's a change that was not there before, that more and more people in Russia, whom you would not expect to do so normally, are talking about violence, are talking about not just any resistance, but violent resistance to what is happening. And violent resistance from all sides, both from the liberal side and from the conservative side. Again, I can give many examples, but that's precisely the case of looking at everything and finding all sorts of different things happening everywhere, in popular music, in the press, in public statements, maybe not so much in film, because film is so state dependent because of the funding and so on and so forth. So there are many things that are going on, and I'm not sure that they have all settled into a pattern. But one thing which I do see now, I think, which is new and interesting and dangerous, is that in a way it is predictable. What this war made possible, it made violence as such more acceptable. But what forms this violence will take, that's an interesting question. Because just like in Russia they were saying no more war, they're still saying, many people are saying, no more revolutions. You know, but then there are people who are calling for revolutions. So what that will, how that will play out, I don't know.
We're basically at the end, but I'm happy to go a little bit longer if there's someone from the audience who wants to come back. There's nobody from the audience to come back, then it's my privilege to end up the whole thing. Yeah, that coming perhaps a little bit about the question about the deep cultural code. We will not return to it, but in a sense, if I understand you correctly, you have tried to see the changes through the mirror effect that it has with in the official discourse, so to speak. And as the anthropologist would of course not be entirely convinced by one which is only looking at the elite, but there is a way in which it of course mirrors also what comes from elsewhere, from the poetry, from the other expressions of the cultural code. It is not a particularly nice story that we have heard today, right? It's the state of war as being the default position of thinking politics. It is the reversal of Clausewitz, which is the geopolitical tradition which has taken its main role. It usually doesn't work on the long run, but it can do a lot of damage in between, which we are experiencing right now. It is not entirely clear how politics can take its place afterwards again, and how it will take its place afterwards again, whether it is just a brand ambassador and then there will be the other guys following afterwards. But if it doesn't work really well, the brand ambassadors will have the same troubles than the late leaders of the Soviet Union had at some point. It will not resonate very well again, but it looks like an endless cycle, which seems to have been going on with Russia for quite a while. So unfortunately, it's not an upbeat kind of part here, although from both the question and your last answer, there's also the sense that there is not just opposition, as if there's Putin is the bad guy and then if the good guys are coming, but that there is a society which is in evolution to some extent, that there is something which is going on. It's only hard to pin it down, but today's talk was about at least one way of trying to pin it down, namely through analyses of cultural codes. And I would like to thank you for your presence, thank everyone here on the panel, and Alex Astroff for being with us. Thanks very much.